Welcome to The Cutting Edge. How could lifting trade restrictions on Cuba by the U.S. affect energy companies? EnergyWire's David Ferris is here with a look at how the U.S. stands to benefit from a change in policy. David, what are Cuba's biggest energy challenges right now?
Well, thanks for having me, Monica. My colleague Nate Grobenwald and I wanted to look at what's going on in Cuba right now because it's possibly on the verge of a transition unlike anything it's seen in the last 50 years. And we wanted to look at what the opportunities are for energy companies in the U.S. with a potential opening to Cuba. And the biggest single challenge that Cuba faces is fuel. It's like any island, it has difficulty getting fuel because it doesn't have enough of its own. But in Cuba's case, that's exceptionally difficult because of our economic embargo. Makes it impossible to participate in global fuel markets. And so it's had to turn to one patron right now, Venezuela. And that gives it, while it has been a consistent supply for years, Venezuela is having its own problems with the price of oil disrupting its economy. And that fuel supply is endangered, and by becoming more of a full participant in the global economy, it could possibly resolve that fuel problem.
So then what are the opportunities that exist for the U.S. oil and gas industry?
Well, I think the thing that people most need to know is that the energy infrastructure in Cuba is old, really old. It's from the 1940s and 1950s, equipment from the U.S., same vintage as the old Buicks and Chevys that are still driving the streets of Havana, other equipment from the Soviets in the 1960s, and it's all ripe for replacement, and all of that equipment is stuff that that needs to be replaced if the Cuban people are to experience a higher standard of living.
And their grid also needs modernization?
Oh, yeah. Their transmission grid is in decent shape, but their power plants and their distribution grid are quite creaky.
And that's somewhere where the U.S. could step in and help as well.
Oh, definitely. We sell some of the best equipment in the world, and suppliers from around the world have been staying out of Cuba because of our embargo. We'd have a new market just 90 miles away from our shore.
How about renewables?
There's a big opportunity for renewables in Cuba as well. I mean, as any tourist knows, the Caribbean is full of wind and sun, and Cuba is no different. And in addition, Cuba it used to be the world's largest exporter of sugar. Right now, its sugar industry is pretty much dormant, but it could produce prodigious amounts of sugar to be used either for biofuels or for bio-based generation.
So if the policy does change, there are still many hurdles on the road ahead, and one of those hurdles is financing. How does Cuba pay for all of these changes and infrastructure improvements?
Well, that is really the big question because Cuba just doesn't have a lot of money lying around. And international lending agencies are probably going to need to step in to lend billions and billions of dollars to revitalize the energy sector. And it's likely that on the terms of those loans, they're going to require some fundamental changes to how the energy sector runs in Cuba. Right now, the Cuban energy sector is one of the most inefficient in the world, is highly overstaffed, and needs and lacks transparency, the kind of transparency you usually see in other energy systems. And so the big question is, how much control is the Cuban government willing to let go in order to bring in the money it needs?
And you report the country has more engineers and PhDs than any other Latin American country. Where could all that talent go? Well,
a big destination for it could be us. And I think one thing that gets overlooked is how much intellectual firepower there is in Cuba. It has a really good educational system. It has a very high literacy rate. It has a lot of engineers. And for example, Florida Power and Light, just across Florida Strait from Cuba. Its former CEO, a lot of its current and former vice presidents, some of its head engineers were all born in Cuba. And it would be a big benefit of an opening with Cuba is the brain power that it could bring to our shores.
All right, and readers can find this story in today's EnergyWire.
Yes,
Thank you for joining me, David.
Thank you.
More Cutting Edge coming next Friday. We'll see you then.